Some of us from Trinity have been in England the last week in London, and a lot happened the week that we were there. Martin McGuinness died. It's fascinating to watch from London, the coverage of his life and his death and his critical role in the Northern Ireland peace process at the end of his life. And there was a knife attack at Westminster while we were there, and again, fascinating to watch how the English handle this kind of thing very differently than we do, frankly. Just interesting. And while all this was happening, as you can imagine, this week in our politics, we're reading the paper every morning and every night and during the day trying to figure out what's happening in this country and what's happening with healthcare and where it will go. And in the middle of all this, I'm reading these texts, and I have to say I had a moment where I thought it's a little bit like the blind leading the blind. The blind aren't good in the Bible. And I say this mindful that there are people in this room who are blind legally. There are probably people listening to us on our webcast who are blind. We have friends and relatives and people we know closely and hold dear to us that are blind, and we might ourselves, some of us, become blind in our lives. It's a real thing. It's a physical condition that happens to people. The text is unfailingly unkind to the blind. Now, there are a couple of different ways you can approach the Bible, and most of us in scholarship, what you look for is, what were they trying to say at the time? Right? If we understood the context of when something was written and what those words would have meant and how people communicated with each other at that time, we might know more accurately what they're trying to tell us. You know, Jesus was an American Southerner. Jesus didn't live in Manhattan. Many concepts that are central to us today and that we read right into the Bible, we assume they're talking about us right now, just wouldn't have been there. So we struggle with how do we get to what they're actually talking about. They're clearly important things that they're talking about that we need to understand. And there's a strain of biblical scholarship that would say, and also we need to know how that text is forming us. We become Christians, we become people in relationship to this text, whether we engage it or not, because we culturally know this text. One of the things this text tells us, and we know it's metaphor, like many things are metaphor, but this text tells us, is blind is bad. Now, I don't agree with that. I suspect you don't agree with that either. I don't want that to be a bias I carry. Right? I would assume that if I'm like anyone in that text, I'm like that healed blind man that can see, right? Or maybe I'm that person behind the Pharisees who was listening to the conversation but knew what Jesus really meant, right? Something like that. But the text is actually pretty clear. And it doesn't make it very easy. So it says that the man is minding his own business, and Jesus walks by. It doesn't actually say if he's begging or not. It says later that he has someone that had begged. It just says he's doing his thing. For all we know, he's walking with friends or family, right? We don't know what state of life he's in, but you probably have an image, because in other parts of the text, beggars are, blind people are begging, or it's more described what they're doing, and we tend to put all those together. In this one, just as Jesus walks by a guy doing his thing, and he's blind, and it says Jesus goes, spits on the ground, takes some dirt, and makes a little mud cake thing, like a face pack or something, and sticks it on the guy's eyes. If you notice in the text, Jesus doesn't say, "Hello, blind man, I'm Jesus, the Son of Mary. What do you need from me? May I touch you? How are you? What's your name?" He does versions of that in other texts and in other stories. But in this one, he comes right up to him. And can you imagine? Some of you have eyesight as poor as mine. If you took off those glasses, you can't see much coming up at you, right? Can you imagine some mud just coming right at you and on your face and a voice? I might not like that very much. I suspect this man is used to being touched without being asked, and is used to speculation about himself. It's kind of how it went at the time. And the story goes forward. We know it's a metaphor and that we all live in darkness and we don't see the light and resurrection is coming and Easter's a couple of weeks away. We know that. We get that part. But this is a very long reading about a man who has something happen to him, and then who was questioned over and over and over about what has happened to him, because nobody can understand it. And he has the integrity to just say, have no idea, but I tell you, I can see. And if any of you read Oliver Sacks, or the late, great Oliver Sacks, he's kind of brought to public information and to preachers that if you've been blind your entire life, if you've never seen, and you can all of a sudden because of medicine or surgery or something like that, some great innovation, your brain can't make any sense of what is happening. Right? If you have not formed your brain to work with your eyes as a child, right? If you don't crawl for a while as a kid, your depth perception is bad, mine is very poor. There are all kinds of pieces of organizing life that happen in your brain that organize how you see early on, and if you don't do it, can't happen, doesn't happen. So what you see is a blur of color and light, and it looks one-dimensional, and there's nothing to do. You can't reach out and know which one is closer and which one is further. It would be like looking up at this and seeing it all as flat. How do you make any sense of that? And again, I get it's a metaphor, but can you imagine if that's what happened to that guy? That all of a sudden he could see light and see color and sort of see shapes. I have no idea what any of that was, but everyone said he could see, so this must be what seeing is. Can you imagine? That here it is. Here is God's freedom, God's justice, God's healing, and maybe creating some sense of a reality that none of us can imagine, something different than the normal life that you would assume we would be healed into. So the reason I'm thinking about it this way this year is at the Queen's Foundation in Birmingham this week, and John Hull was a beloved and famous faculty member there. When he trained to do theology, he was a sighted person, and that's how he talked about himself, a sighted person. He could see. And in the course of his life, his eyesight degenerated, and he became a blind person and a scholar. I think 20 years of his scholarly life or more, he could not see. He said when he did his early scholarship, he read about the blind. They're bad in the Bible. He's the one that made that clear to me. They're a site of action for healing. People ask about what sins they carry. So he decided to listen to John again as a blind man. He had to listen. It was a cassette tape because he could not read. So he listened, and he said with all of his training, his theological training, his faith, what he heard was that salvation is light, and it is vision, and people like him needed to be healed for it. What he heard was that he was wrong, a site of sin, that he was bad, with all of his training, and that's what he heard. And so he wrote, and this is a wonderful thing to read if you have time, he wrote a chapter in a book that is a blind man writing to a sighted Savior, and it's a lament and a protest, as you can imagine, and ends beautifully and surprisingly with Jesus blindfolded at his own trial, and the darkness that falls during the crucifixion, and that maybe something happens in the dark. It's beautiful. But it contests for me what I have always thought knowledge was about and what we're doing here on this earth. That maybe we are actually like the blind leading the blind, and that might be the most tender and beautiful way to go through this life. He points out that in that, Jesus says that like the blind leading the blind is a horrible thing, that they fall into the ditch together, right? That's in the Gospels. He says, but if you've actually been a blind person led by a blind person, it's the best leading that you can get. If you're being led by a sighted person, people like me, they forget to mention that there's a curb right there that you go up or down, or all of a sudden, yes, oh, we're on an escalator. You forget because your feet just take you there and you can see. And you're actually often terrifying to someone who is blind to be led around by a sighted person. And if you've been on 14th Street or 23rd Street in the city, you've watched people training one another and learning with one another who are physically disabled, who are deaf, or who are blind, how to negotiate the streets of this city. He says when you walk with someone who's blind, you're groping your way through together, and we don't fall into ditches. We don't, we might hit a rose bush every once in a while or get a little scratched up. We know what we're doing. We know what we're doing with one another and for one another in a way that none of you ever do for us. It is the most confident way to walk through the world. When I think of resurrection and light in the Gospel of John, I think of light and truth, that we will know what is right and just, and we will know how to do it, and we will know what God demands of us. But I wonder if John is also pointing us to that in this time, because Jesus says he will be the light of the world, he is the light of the world, and the light will go away. Maybe we're living in that time where we are in darkness, like the blind leading the blind. And as Paul says, we need to stay awake and vigilant, Because the blind can move around in the dark as well as in the light, but we need to be awake and vigilant. The forces of evil are around us that tell you and ask you, but how can it be that you bearer of great sin, have anything to say to the rest of us? That there is any hope or healing or truth in you? And the blind man says today, I don't know, but this is what's happened to me. As Christians, that is our testimony. We know what has happened to us. We can imagine a society and a place where the poor are lifted up, right? We can imagine a justice we cannot make out except in blur and color. We don't know how to get our hands on it, but we know that that's what seeing is. We've been told. I wonder if it's the most accurate description of the reign of God's justice that I have ever heard. We know it's there. We can see something. I don't know that we know exactly what it is, but we know some of the steps along the way because we are very much like the blind leading the blind. God bless us, and may we stay awake and vigilant and hopeful in this time. Amen.